Welcome, everyone. My name is Elena Kidd, and I'm a program director with the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Public Health's Office of Public Health Practice. And I'm very excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Difficult Dialogues, Learning Effective Communication About Tough Topics, featuring Dr. Adam Brooks from the University of Alabama. This webinar is made possible by the Alabama Regional Center for Infection Prevention and Control Training and Technical Assistance Center, or ARC IPC. The ARC IPC was established to meet the consultation and support service needs surrounding infection prevention and control throughout the state of Alabama. The center is a collaborative effort of the Alabama Department of Public Health's Infectious Disease and Outbreaks Division and the University of Alabama at Birmingham. The ARC IPC provides training and technical assistance to infection prevention and control and public health professionals in areas needed to detect, respond to, control, and prevent infectious disease outbreaks. And you can learn more about the center, view and listen to past trainings, webinars, and podcasts, request training and technical assistance center, view infection prevention resources, and sign up for our newsletter on uab.edu/ARCIPC. And you can also email arcipc@uab.edu with any questions. We'd like to thank our co-sponsor for today's webinar, the Region 4 Public Health Training Center. The Region 4 Public Health Training Center has a number of online workshops throughout March and April, and you can visit their website to learn more about their center and the trainings that they offer. We'd also like to let you know about our next upcoming webinar with Mary Duncan, Infection Prevention. What is it? Can it really help protect us from pathogens? This webinar, Mary Duncan, Senior Director of Infection Prevention at the University of Alabama at Birmingham Health System, will explain what infection prevention is and how it can help protect us from infectious diseases. She will also review the evolution of infection prevention and explore key infection prevention measures that are used every day. This webinar will also be presented by the ARC IPC and co-sponsored by the Region 4 Public Health Training Center and the Deep South Center for Occupational Health and Safety, and it is approved by the Alabama Board of Nursing for 1 CEU contact hours. It'll be held on Tuesday, March 22nd at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. So finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Adam Brooks. Dr. Brooks is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama, where he helped found the Speaking Studio and directs the award-winning public speaking program. Dr. Brooks frequently lends his expertise to courses in critical decision-making and communication and diversity, where he helps people engage in difficult subjects. Dr. Brooks has coached numerous individuals to national acclaim by helping organizations like Southern Light, Regions Bank, and Allstate Insurance cut the noise and lead with meaning. He is also the author of the recently published book, Engineer to Speak, from Wiley Press, on how technical professionals can use communication and presentation skills to share their ideas more effectively. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Brooks, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm so glad to be here with all of you today. I want to get started with just a little bit of a story to kind of set where a lot of this is coming from for me. I want to bring your minds back to June and July of 2021, which I know feels like both a week and about 8 years ago. And my experience was, it was around the time where the CDC had just changed its guidelines that said that if you were fully vaccinated, you could participate in things more regularly without wearing masks. And at the institution where I taught, it created a lot of discussions about, well, how do we talk to our students about who is vaccinated and unvaccinated, and what are the ways in which we can structure those? And I remember I was in a class and a lot of the students were talking about the vaccine and vaccine hesitancy. And a student that I'd known for a very long time waits till everyone leaves and comes out to me and he's like, well, I'm just upset about this whole vaccine conversation that UA is trying to have. And I said, okay, well, what's going on? He's like, well, I just want to let you know, like, I'm not going to get this vaccine. I said, okay. He's like, what, you don't have things to say about that? I said, that's not my job. My job is to help educate you and help find resources. He's like, well, I already know what you're going to say, Dr. Brooks. I know everything you're going to say. And I was like, well, you really don't. And then he started going on about how he felt like everyone was trying to change him and everyone was trying to bully him into doing something. And he didn't really trust anything. And I said, well, tell me more about your concerns. He started talking more. And I said, okay, well, it sounds like you don't really trust what's happening in the media. He's like, absolutely not. I said, okay, great. I don't want you to get your information from the media. I want you to get your information from a medical provider or a doctor. Like, do you have a doctor? He's like, no. Like, have you seen a doctor in the last 2-3 years? He's like, no, I haven't. I wouldn't even know where to get an appointment. I said, okay, well, then now I know how to help you. I'm going to help you find a doctor that can answer all these questions for you because you don't really want to hear it from me. That's not my area of expertise. Let's get you connected with a person that's going to better enable you to do the things that you want to do and how you're going to do them. And it's this idea of being able to structure a conversation in a meaningful way that drives to a positive pro-social outcome is exactly what I want to get into with all of you today. My name is Dr. Adam Brooks, and as Elena said, I'm the Director of Public Speaking at the University of Alabama. Now, for the last 10 years or so, I've been teaching classes in both critical decision-making and communication and diversity, which means I spend a lot of my time talking with people about how we talk about really challenging subjects, the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, the things that always come with a sense of inherent risk. And at the same time, my area of research deals with how people with technical and scientific backgrounds, those in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, how they learn to be better communicators with folks that don't share technical backgrounds. And combining that expertise is a lot of why I wanted to talk to you all today, because we know how important and vital communication is within almost every field of our lives these days. And I don't think I have to overemphasize the examples over the last 2.5 years of this pandemic about the need for those folks in the medical world and in public health to learn to communicate about things that can feel very frustrating. Because for a lot of us, we understand that for you, it's never been a matter of belief. And so all of a sudden, hearing that you have to learn to talk with people who have a different belief system than you feels like, but this isn't about beliefs. This is facts. So that's what I want to have a discussion about today, is to help you learn about what effective communication is. Now, here's the truth, is that we don't really leave jobs or leave an industry. We tend to leave other people. It's not the roles that we play that make things difficult, but it is the people that we surround ourselves with where things can be most frustrating. Sometimes in our jobs, we feel like this. We just want to scream because we also feel like there's a lot of tension and not a lot of support to be able to validate that tension. And that is where things can get a little frustrating. We also know that based upon a report that was given to the Bureau of Economic Research, about 7 out of 10 individuals who were surveyed identified that they've been putting off having a conversation for over 6 months. We know that we have to communicate now more than ever, and we have to get better at it than ever before because the stakes are really high. And at the same time, it can be really frustrating. You're dealing with things like misinformation, disinformation, stress, and all of that can coincide into making our conversations more heated and less impactful. Now, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about communication. And the fallacy of communication is that we believe that because we talk all the time, that we understand how that is processed. And I'm not going to lie to you, all of you here today, because I believe that good communication is about being honest. A lot of what I'm going to share with you is incredibly simple. I'm going to say that again. A lot of what I'm going to share with you today is incredibly simple. Now, the reason why we tend to ignore it is because it's so simple. We tend to do it so often that we forget about how we communicate. And there are some things, tactics and tools that will better enable us to do so. So I want to spend the next 45 minutes going over first, what is effective communication? What does it look like and how can we learn to do it better? Then we'll address some of the barriers that make it the most difficult to have conversations around really tough issues, things like the global pandemic, COVID-19, the vaccine, and other areas where tensions get high and it becomes really difficult to feel like you're actually gaining progress. Then we'll talk about how we can both be better constructors of messages and also better receivers with some tools that will help guide some of those conversations and things to keep in mind as they're going. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the chat function to ask you a few questions here and there. So make sure you use so, or if there's things that I'm saying that spark something for you, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And at the end, we'll be able to loop around and address some of those. So let's get into, first and foremost, what is effective communication? What does it look like and why do we do it? So here's my question for you. In the chat function, I want you to put, what was the last time you had a difficult conversation with somebody and what was it about? So in the chat, I want you to put the last time that you had a difficult conversation with somebody and what was it about? So in the chat, I want you to find your keyboard and I want you to write down, when was the last time you had a difficult conversation with somebody or what was it about? And if you're viewing this after we've recorded it, go ahead and take out a little notepad and just think for a second of the last difficult conversation that you had. You're a teenager in college. This morning, a conversation about policies and application in real life, resisting expectations, finances with my spouse. I can definitely relate to that. A personal conflict you have with somebody else. 6 months ago about poor performance. COVID vaccination with a close friend. We face these things all the time. And I'm sort of curious, those of you that wrote into the chat, think about, how did it go? How did you leave feeling? Did you feel frustrated? Did you feel enabled? Did you feel like you had the proper tools to engage in that conversation in a more productive, pro-social way? You had a difficult, Jonathan felt exhausted. Thomas felt relieved. Someone felt unheard. Okay. You felt fearful, felt like you were talking to a wall. You were worried, you were anxious, you were disgusted, you were upset. These tend to be what happens a lot of times. The more difficult the conversation, the more thought we have to have about how we do that. These are really good. Keep them coming. So for a long time, the studies about communication believed that things are pretty simple. And because I live in the state of Alabama and I teach at a particular roll tidy kind of school, wink, wink, I was taught when I moved here that I should relay every piece of information in the context of the metaphor of football. So allow me to do that for you all here. We used to believe that effective communication was pretty simple. There was a sender, and the sender is kind of like a quarterback. They send a message. When you're talking to your spouse about finances, you're like, all right, I'm going to tell you what this is. And then we have a receiver whose job it is to connect to the message, receive it, and we're good. Now, continuing with the metaphor, in football, is that how that works? Is it that simple that there is a sender and a receiver, and the person sends the message and the person receives it? So those of you that are football fans, if you ever watch American football, is that as simple as it is? Lauren says, no, absolutely. What else happens here? What else goes on here? Yeah, there's defense, there's interference, there's planning, there's the right plays, there's a lot of moving parts, just like football. There's interceptions, absolutely. The message and the signal can be unclear. Maybe the sender told you to run right and they decided to run all the way left. And all of a sudden they're trying to make up for that. Just like football tends to be way more complex, our conversations also have that inherent complexity. We are much more evolved than just a sender to receiver. But sometimes when we're trying to think about difficult dialogues, we want to go in and just say, this is what I'm going to say, and that person's going to receive it. I said it to them. They heard it. We have moved on. But oftentimes we're forgetting there's a lot of complexity. Now, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we really expanded on the development of communication research. And a man named Berlow came up with what was known as the SMCR model, or source, message, channel, receiver. Now, what's interesting about this model that I'm showing you here is that it does still encapsulate a lot of the more complexities that we see. For example, you might notice that the sender has attitudes, values, knowledge systems, culture that plays a part in how they encode a message. And it also shapes the channels. Whether we are doing this right now via a webinar, that influences how a lot of you are receiving this particular message that I'm giving you right now. Maybe you've put it on in the background while you're trying to do other stuff and answering emails. Now we have more elements of complexity that we have to consider as I think about ways to shape the message. You might notice one of the things that I do is I'm constantly asking you to chime in on the chat, therefore encouraging you to stay connected in this way. All of this is a part of both encoding and decoding. But what's missing here is a very crucial step of the communication process. Communication is not linear. It doesn't go from one to the other. It is multifaceted and involves something very important known as feedback and audience center. A lot of times when we think about the ways in which we communicate, especially if you are in a position of leadership, you might believe that because the way that you are has gotten to you this place, there's not value or worth in changing and shaping who you are. Different studies by the Harvard Business Review have looked at behaviors are not character traits, but have potential for improvement. We also know that communication exists in the same area of the brain as the limbic system, which is noted for emotional intelligence and other areas. Now, the ways in which we grow our emotional intelligence and communication abilities is through three factors: motivation, practice, and feedback. So today we'll address some of that motivation factor and give you a chance to practice. The feedback, that's going to come from a lot of work on all of our parts. But I'm curious though, why do we do this? What is the point of communicating? Has anyone ever thought before about why do we have people? Why do we communicate? What is the point of communication? So in the chat, I want you to take a guess about what you believe the point of communication is. Why do we do it? To share ideas and connect, express feelings, to relay messages, to get your needs met, to get everyone on the same page, to survive. Ooh, I like that. To teach, to expand awareness, to understand one another, to understand. I love this. To express oneself. Okay. Even when I ask you about why we do this, we can hear some of the nuances there. The word communication comes from the Latin word communicare, which literally means to share or put in common. All communication is an exchange of energy. And ultimately, we don't look for communication just to share information. Recent studies in public health communication, in a proceeding that came out of the Mayo Clinic in 2021, showed that a lot of health practitioners believe in what was known as a very linear model about the way they shape messages. They call this the science to policy pipeline. They believe that we have scientists that discover stuff, and then there's a linear model in terms of we give people information and then they do the right thing based on that information all the time. We know that not to be true on a very functional level. And if you've ever had teenagers, you know explicitly what I'm talking about. I argue that the point of communication is not just to share information, but to make information meaningful. And when we are operating from a place of meaning and understanding, it changes how we provide, encode, and deliver those messages. If our goal is to build understanding and meaning, then all of a sudden we have to be conscious about the ways in which we deliver quality information, especially about things where we have complex belief systems that make it difficult. Now, there are three goals when it comes to communication. The first is to create that sense of shared meaning, getting everybody on the same page, as some of you said in the chat. Then we also want to express our understanding and relay value and respect. When you're thinking about having really difficult conversations, you also always have to begin back at that first principles. What am I trying to accomplish? When I'm done, what do I want people to feel like? Because people will remember how they feel out of a conversation more than they remember what the information was exchanged. Now, part of this is also understanding the importance of centering and making space for a conversation. We also think about verbal communication being very different from written communication. When we're having a conversation, we tend to think about things in terms of a process, but we also tend to process what we hear in verbal communication. When someone's talking to us, we put it into context of pre-existing narratives. Meaning we process information through culturally transmitted values. And as public health practitioners, if we ignore the culturally transmitted value, we do so at our peril. So why is this so hard? Why do we have a whole webinar trying to teach us how to communicate if it really is that simple? Well, there are a couple of barriers to effective communication that I want to spend some time exploring. So first, we used to believe that things were bifurcated, right? If you've ever taken a philosophy class, maybe you've encountered this before, that there was a rational way that we processed information, and then there was the emotional way that we processed information. And we thought, okay, well, we process things, we'll first make sense of information, then we develop an emotional response. Well, what a lot of studies are showing about communication practices is that when we hear something, we develop an emotional response first. We develop an emotional response first. Then we seek out information to validate our emotional response. Meaning that if we want to be better at communicating about difficult subjects, we have to be present and think about emotion on the front end of every conversation that we have, rather than relegating it to a secondary process. It is not a secondary, emotion is not secondary, it is primary in how we process information. And so I think as public health professionals, you would be wise to consider that in how you structure things. Now for this, I want you to think back to your chat. And does anyone know the difference or distinction between hearing and listening? Between hearing and listening. Maybe some of you have been to a couple therapists in your time, and you've probably heard the phrase, well, I know that you are hearing me, but you're not listening. So in the chat, I want you to describe the difference between hearing and listening. Listening is active. Listening includes processing. Yes, Dania, perfect. Hearing is the act of hearing sounds. So hearing is a physiological process. It is the physiological process of sound waves bouncing off of your eardrums. Listening is a cognitive process that involves a couple of steps. And a lot of times we might be hearing someone, but we're rarely taking the active step to listen to them. There are some barriers from research that we know about what is making listening so hard. And I think in particular, when it comes to heightened conversations, especially things like the pandemic, we often, first and foremost, we think that someone's ambushing us. We're like, where is this coming from? And our minds are jumping to where is this going, as opposed to being present in this place. We also tend to listen for facts, especially when we are dealing with issues that are heavy with misinformation, like COVID-19, like the vaccine and vaccine hesitancy. A lot of times when we are encountering people who may come from a different perspective than we do, they're listening for us to say X, Y, and Z because they have a pre-programmed response to that. They're like, I'm waiting for you to bring up this, so now I can take the direction in a completely different way. And all of a sudden, we've lost the main through line about what we're supposed to get. We also tend to fake attention. So sometimes, I'll be honest, as much as I am a mama's boy, when my mom calls and they start talking into the third hour or so, I start to go, yep, yeah, that sounds good, even though my brain is going somewhere else. We also tend to think faster than we can speak. Now, sometimes this also deals with distracting delivery. Like when someone has a particular verbal filler. I teach a lot of undergraduate students, and when someone uses a lot of ums, yeahs, likes, and you knows, I start paying attention to that instead of listening to what they actually have to say. Then we also have things like arrogance and disrespect in terms of pre-programmed responses that we have with other folks. But this last one is probably the most difficult barrier that we have to effective listening. Our pre-programmed emotional response, especially because most of the time when we are dealing with difficult topics, none of us is coming in there like a fresh jury. Think about it from the court's perspective. Courts oftentimes look for people who have no prior knowledge about a particular defendant or case, so they can hear something fresh. For the rest of us in society, everything we encounter is filtered through culturally transmitted values about how we process things. And that is going to sometimes dictate our response. The metaphor that oftentimes gets used is that we are little figures riding a giant elephant that's bucking us around, or we have our own internal press secretaries that are responding whenever X, Y, or Z issue gets brought up. When we understand that that's the problem, we can then begin to develop solutions that discuss and direct right where everyone is. It says I'm frozen, so hopefully I have caught back up to everyone. So how do we do this? Well, when we're having a discussion, we ultimately want to bring about what's known as a pool of shared meaning or shared understanding, that sense of commonality, that sense of consubstantiation. One of the most powerful elements of communication is identification. If the person you're talking with believes that they can identify with you, if they can see themselves as you and you see yourself as them, it's going to lead to better outcomes. So there's models about the way that we process things, and we tend to respond to difficult subjects in one of two ways. When we move out of this ring of safety, out of this place where we feel like we're being heard and listened to and values, then we sometimes vacillate into one of two polarizations. We either get real quiet, we withdraw, we avoid, we mask, we pretend like we're fine. No, it's fine. I'm fine. No, I'm fine. I'm fine. Or we get in the bottom section. Now, my spouse is from New Jersey and I grew up in the Midwest. So I tend to respond to conflict by the north quadrant. I'm a withdrawer. I'll get real quiet when I get angry. My spouse is from New Jersey. So we see a lot of labeling, attacking, name calling. Neither of these are creating this sense of safety that allows us to be productive. And when you're having a difficult conversation, you have to think about, how am I communicating a sense of safety to the person that I'm engaging with? Because if we start to notice withdrawal, if we start to notice avoiding, and then you respond with labeling and attacking, that is going to continue that polarization and not create a space of shared understanding. At the same time, when it comes to persuasion, we also know that when people have strongly held beliefs about something, they are not going to move from what social scientists call this latitude of acceptance and rejection. So if someone's way over here in the latitude of rejection, they're not going to move all the way from rejection to acceptance in one conversation. What is possible is getting them to move from rejection to non-committal. So thinking this through, there are some implications for how we might structure difficult topics. Researchers have done some interesting audience-centered research about how do people respond to difficult subjects. Now, in this case, the series of studies that this is built upon was dealing with two things that were in part of national conversation. So we don't have up-to-date data about the ways in which this plays into effect for things like the COVID vaccine, but there's a lot of crossover, and I think the theory still applies. So here's where we respond. We tend to respond in terms of avoidance, doom, dissonance, denial, and identity. And I'm going to break down what each of those mean in a minute. But there's some interesting elements that happen. When we come to difficult subjects and people are trying to tell us what to do, we have some evolutionary barriers that make that a very unproductive process. The first is that we tend to care about things that directly impact us. We have what's known as a propensity for self-interest, meaning that, yes, I might believe that something is good for the larger populace, but I'm going to be more questionable about how that impacts my direct vicinity, my direct area. The examples that are given sometimes in a 2016 study was they interviewed mothers that were vaccine hesitant. Now, this was not about the COVID vaccine, but a different vaccine. And they articulated things like, well, I might feel okay with other people's children having that, but I'm still going to be extra critical about or hesitant about my own child doing it. The second factor here, I think, is really interesting and has a lot of implications. It's this concept that status is relative, meaning that we can't always compare ourselves and feel grateful to sense of things in absolutes. Like, we should feel so grateful that we have access to a free, safe, and effective vaccine here in the United States, because all over the world, they would be begging for this kind of thing. That doesn't always motivate people because that presumes an absolute status symbol. What we know about human beings is that we tend to compare ourselves to the people that we are around a lot. The common example is the greatest predictor for whether or not someone will make changes in their recycling habits or in putting solar panels on their home is going to be what your neighbors do. So trying to think this through about making messages about sort of, well, we need to do this for the greater good you have to frame things in terms of the good of the people that they see around. The third element has direct implications for the pandemic. We copy what we see. So when we try to point to bad behavior and say, look at all these people doing this bad thing, if you're predisposed to doing that thing, you are more likely then, after being shown people doing that thing, to do it. Now, there's implications here. We can point to things and say, well, look at all these people doing this bad behavior. It signals to the brain, wait, they're doing that bad behavior. I can do that bad behavior. And the last two is that we tend to value our present self over some delayed future. We say, okay, yes, I understand what that looks like far into the future, but here in my present, this is what's happening. And it's difficult for people to feel like they're taking action on problems they can't see or feel. And I think you all have examples of conversations you've had where you're trying to make the case for how dire a situation is. And the people on the receiving end of that conversation are going, I don't know, where I live, this is just not that big of an issue. It's difficult for people to accept problems and take action on things they can't see or feel. Now, how do we get better about this? So we've covered what good communication is, and we've dealt with some of the problems that prevent us from being effective. So now we have to think through, what's the solution? Well, in this, you want to consider, are you trying to engage in a dialogue with someone, or are you trying to engage in a debate? What is the difference? So in the chat function, I'm curious to know what you perceive to be the difference between a dialogue and a debate. Because most of the time, when things start to get heated, when you feel upset, as you said to me earlier in the chat, when you said you feel exhausted, you feel unproductive, you've probably been engaging in some kind of debate with the other person rather than a dialogue. Bernie, dialogue requires someone to be open to discussion. Debate's trying to win a side. Yes. Not much learning in a debate. Debate is being right. Yes, in a debate, your position, your mind is already made up. You are coming marshaled with that. Absolutely. Debate tends to be about changing someone's mind. Okay. All of these are correct in some fashion, and we'll go into a little Venn diagram here. But I want to invite you over the next 15 minutes to consider what a dialogue model might be like and how you can begin to practice it. The first tool in a really good, effective dialogue is active listening. And some of you have already identified the importance of active listening. But in case this is something you've never really thought about, here are the ways this tends to be theorized. Active listening is a 4-step model about how we tend to process things, and it forces us to slow down. I encourage you to look at this image here on the slide that asks, are you listening or are you waiting to speak? In a lot of cases, we are just waiting to speak. But if you notice, there are 4 steps to listening: receiving, understanding, evaluating, and then responding. When we receive an information, we take it in. We start to then trying to understand the other person's viewpoint, trying to receive it in the manner and intention in which it is given. Then we begin to try to understand or make sense of it. We put it into comparisons of schemas that we have within our brains. Where does our mind tell us, and how can we relate this to your individual or collective experience? Then step 3 is you evaluate that. You say, okay, I'm hearing this and I understand they're trying to tell me this. And then where are you coming from in relationship to that understanding? You do all of those things before you respond. You do a lot of cognitive work. Now, in this, I also want to plant a bug in all of your ears and remind you of a very simple phrase that's going to save a lot of heartache for all of you. Not every stimulus requires a response. Sometimes when you are having a difficult dialogue with someone, it means letting them say some things to you that you feel very qualified are crazy. And I hate to use that word, but that sense of, how am I not supposed to respond to that? That is absolutely insane. How do you think? You're responding, you are reacting. Not every stimulus requires a response. You don't need to react to everything. You don't need to be as reactive to that. And part of that is just getting your mind right. Now, this means a lot of work. And sometimes you're like, why are we the ones that always have to change? Why are we the ones that always have to be thinking ahead? And I understand the frustration with that. I really do. And I want to give voice to that frustration. But I find that conversations are more productive if you remind yourself of what the outcome is. What is the outcome? If the outcome is we're able to save some lives, we're able to create better health understanding, where we're able to strengthen our relationships before we deal with something really heavy, it's worth it to go through these processes. Now, let's go back to that dialogue versus debate for a moment. In a debate, when you're debating someone, you're defending your position against all critique. Your goal is to prove your point. And in this, you are not a person. You are not Adam Brooks. You are representing a side. And you cannot let an inch of ground off of that side. Let's contrast that with a dialogue. In a dialogue, your goal is to listen to everyone. And you have new responses beyond just ideology. When you begin to just listen to the things that people say, and you don't react or respond to every micro point, you can find opportunities for shared meaning and common ground. Maybe you can't accept everything that they're saying, but there is something, a nugget, a wisdom, a central tenet of their ideology or belief system that you're able to grasp onto and connect with to build out that sense of anchoring. In communication, we call this an anchor, a sense of a way to ground the conversation in something that both parties agree to and both presently value. When you begin a difficult conversation on the basis of shared values, it can get stronger. Now, in this, we have what's known in science communication, and a lot of my research points to the belief in what's known as an information deficit model, where we think the more difficult the subject is, that people just need better information. If I'm going to send my cousin this latest news article, and it'll go right to them, and that way, if they're going to read it, they're going to know it, they're going to understand it. And that is rarely, if ever, the case. What we see more actively, and in a 2020 book about vaccine hesitancy that came out, most of it was written in 2019 before the pandemic, but there's still some value there. They said that the biggest issue was actually not the lack of information, but the lack of trust. And there are some factors that contribute to that sense of distrust. The first is the continual use of war metaphors by public institutions. If we continue calling it the war on this, it very quickly jumps to a sense of who is the enemy and who is the victor in those situations. We also have a cognitive biases and public misunderstanding that's motivated by misinformation. And I know that this program is going to put on a webinar on misinformation, so I encourage you to check that out. The last is that science to policy pipeline I talked about, where everything is evidence-based everything. Well, the problem is that we often forget the very human elements that happen. When we blame and shame others for their beliefs and what they're coming to a conversation with, it tends to harden opposition. It also makes people feel like their concerns are dismissed. Studies show that when people voice a concern and they have their concerns listened to, they're more likely to take action on the thing if their concerns are addressed. Another interesting finding in the research tells us that admitting to uncertainty, admitting what you don't know, admitting where there's areas of potential agreement on, yeah, I can see how that can be confusing. I totally get it because I get confused by it too. It gets a little bit overwhelming. It actually does not undermine trust. Finally, people are motivated by positive language. They want to feel good about the actions that they are taking. So the examples can sometimes be if medical professionals, in the cases of vaccines, they've done a 2022 study that came out about a month ago, talked about how if doctors came in and said, all right, we're getting the vaccine today, versus how do you feel about the vaccine? That can sometimes change the outcomes of what's happening. Regardless of whether we're talking about vaccines or any other element, trying to find areas of positive language because people want to feel good about the subjects that they're engaging in. So I'm going to teach you a question to ask yourself whenever you find yourself in a difficult dialogue or when you know when something's coming up. And the best thing you can do is get a little piece of paper and put a little notepad as you're scribbling through 5 minutes before the meeting. Ask yourself, what do I really want from the conversation? When I'm done, what am I trying to accomplish? When I'm done, what is it I'm trying to accomplish? The reason why that's so important is it ultimately will keep you from changing and reacting to, because you know, will this get me the outcome of how I'm supposed to engage this conversation? Or will it make them retreat? Will it make them mask? Will it make them attack and name call? What is it I really want from this conversation? Then think about, what is the strategy that's best going to get me there? It's probably going to be creating an open dialogue. I'm not going to respond when they say things. I'm not going to give a reaction that allows us to get into a debate. Some of that can be very helpful in structuring the conversation in more powerful and pro-social ways. Now, I mentioned earlier, there are some responses that people do when we're in difficult dialogues. And the first one is that we tend to avoid it. So there's some language choices you can avoid that will trigger that. Sometimes if we frame an issue as a science issue, that tends to turn a lot of people off. They go, well, it's a science issue, then I don't really have to worry about it because there are scientists that have to deal with that. Or if we just show someone abstract graphs and we don't explain to them what those graphs mean, that can oftentimes trigger a sense of avoiding it and going, I'm overwhelmed, there's too much here, I need to just shut this off and not pay attention. And that can create more problems. It also tends to happen if we talk about things only as a future state. Remember those evolutionary barriers I mentioned about how people are more active in involving their present than in the future. What do they do when they hear this? Well, they limit the information. They emphasize, well, I mean, some of this is just natural, right? There are more urgent matters to focus on. I know I saw this a lot during the pandemic. When people would talk about it, they would say, well, why aren't we really talking about the obesity epidemic? And you can see that sense of avoidance, trying to remove the cognitive dissonance about the uncomfortable things that happen. So how do we fix that? Well, as communicators, as folks that are trying to engage with people about this stuff, we can make issues feel near, human, and personal to us. What that means is if we can, again, focus on that sense of identity. Most of you are members of a community and you're engaging with people within that same community. Try to find that pool of shared meaning. Where can we find common ground to build from? Because I'm not going to be able to get them to move from that latitude of rejection. So how do I make this issue feel near, human, and personal? I can't talk about the people in New York. I have to talk about people in whatever city that you're in. Speak of specific places and locations where you are, and then point to tangible actions that one person can control. Make the thing very simple for people. Maybe in my example at the top, I talked about, rather than trying to get into the whole back and forth about the vaccine with the student, I helped them find resources so that I could remove that sense of barrier. I was able to help them take that sense of action. Let's do one more. We've got that sense of doom. So a lot of times we'll frame issues as like a loss and cost, or if we don't do blank, then the world as we know it will end. Look at all the stuff that's happening. We see this a lot with things like climate change. We overemphasize messages about sacrifice. Well, people tend to respond to that by playing to fears of the solution. Well, I'm more worried about this than that. They emphasize the costs of how things are going to impact them, or they overemphasize economic ruin. How do we deal with that? Well, phrasing things like, think about it like insurance. A vaccine is your insurance policy for the long-term health and avoiding really serious illness. You don't think about the insurance that you pay because you know that you need to do it, and it's probably better off than playing any kind of risk. Also, focus on the positive emotions. Think through how good it's going to feel knowing that you've done everything that you can to prevent this, and some of the benefits that will happen as a result. Now, I want to go back to those evolutionary barriers that we spoke to at the beginning of the presentation, and how people are motivated by that sense of self-interest and how we can be more direct in engaging in that. You also can use those social barriers as a way of building that. So sometimes what that looks like is using people that are trusted within your community, looking to people who can be good messengers and what that might look like. That can be a really effective tool in helping to bridge that out. The other ways that we can put these ideas into practice is you have to make space for this conversation. To have a really difficult dialogue about things like either COVID or diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, you have to make space and boundaries for them. It can't happen just on a whim. You have to say, hey, this is a really important topic, and I want to get like 20 minutes of your time just to kind of be able to talk and learn and try to understand more about what's happening. Overemphasize that you're not there to change their position, but you're there to listen and try to understand. Inherently, they will also then meet you in that same direction, and you'll be able to find that sense of shared ground. Now, I know we've covered a lot of information, but I want to bring you back to the story of myself with my student that I shared at the beginning of this webinar about how instead of responding to some of the things that he said, because the student said some things that are not backed up by any kind of evidence, I connected them with a medical professional. And about a week later, they came and they showed me their vaccine card. And they were like, you know what? Honestly, I was just letting a lot of the pressure get to me. I talked to a doctor. He made me feel so much better about what I was doing and really understood. And I just appreciated that you listened to me and didn't make me feel like my concerns or my worries were insane. And that made me feel good because it shows that when we open ourselves up to listening to other people, we oftentimes allow that sense of vulnerability to build that. But if we try to layer it through shame and blame and naming and name calling, it can create that sense of hardening the opposition. Today, we spent some time going over what does effective communication look like. You want to think beyond just that sender-receiver model and try to understand where the person is coming from. We then talked about what those barriers are. So I want you to think about the next time you get frustrated. Are you participating in some of those barriers to listening? Are you having that pre-programmed emotional response? And then we gave you some tools to think about how you can be more active by framing things as a dialogic approach in terms of going forward and saying, I want to have a dialogue with you with the purpose to try to build understanding rather than changing the outcome. Remember to ask yourself, when I'm done, what is the thing I want from this conversation? And begin to shape so that you are not overreacting, but you are using that sense of active listening, of receiving, understanding, evaluating, and responding. I want to thank all of you for your time and attention this afternoon. I know how busy you are, and most importantly, I know how exhausted that you are. And I know that hearing something like this is just reiterating that there's more that we have to do. And I wish I could say that that's not the case, but it's true. We have the burden of knowledge. We have the privilege of having access to resources and trying to help people grow, whether that's internally, externally, with people who agree or disagree with us. But I want to encourage you to get good at this. It's a skill. You don't get good at it from the get-go, and you will make mistakes. Be as forgiving of yourself as you have these conversations as you are of the other people. When you operate from a place of grace and forgiveness, as on a cultural level, people are going to be more receptive to what you have to say. I want to thank you all. And we have about 10 minutes to answer or address any questions that you have. Great question. So Heather asked what resources you can learn to. So there are some. In the back of my presentation, I did have some of the studies that I pulled from for this presentation. So you'll be able to see that as well. But there's some great books that can help with that. There's first book that I always stand. It's very, I will say, I know some of y'all like evidence-based, and this is evidence-based, but it's a little self-helpy, but it's called Crucial Conversations. It's a very helpful book to give examples of some of the models that I talked through. Super helpful to read through that. And then I wrote a book called Engineer to Speak. It's dealing with how people with technical backgrounds can learn to talk and communicate with non-technical folks. So you can check those out, but there's also great resources. Alan Alda does a really good series on, and I know that you're hearing Alan Alda, like a MASH fame, but he's put together a center out of a university on science communication, and they put together a series of books on the proper ways to communicate science that can be really useful for that.
Then we had some questions in the Q&A. What are some ways to set boundaries when the other party in a conversation is behaving aggressively?
Yeah, I think when you're having that, I think that's a fantastic question. I would I would say that first and foremost, you want to like recognize the behavior, right? So use language like it's starting to seem like this is getting a little hostile, and I don't want that. I want to be able to feel like we listen to it. Maybe we need to maybe take a little break from this conversation and return back to it where we both can listen to each other differently. Another tool and tactic is to mirror the language that you receive. So before you respond, say, well, what I'm hearing you say is blank. I know that that feels like a very lampooned therapist tool from couples therapy, but it does work in the sense of articulating what I'm understanding, what I'm taking away from this is this. And a good way to close those conversations, also, because this is bringing that forward for me, is at the end of every one of those tough conversations, ask the question, what's something you're taking away from this? Because their takeaway might be very different from what you intended, and then you have an opportunity to reframe that. Daphne asks, how do you communicate with people that demand and not ask? They just sort of demand that with you. I think some of that would be, there's a model called the state model, or start with facts, tell your story, ask for others' paths, talk tentatively, and encourage testing. So with that state model, what that means is like, hey, I noticed that when you came forward to me, you just demanded of what I wanted instead of asking me. And I'm starting to interpret that that maybe the story I'm making up is that you aren't respectful of me. Is that the case? Right? And just kind of like open that up, right? I'm starting with what the phenomenon is that I'm observing, and then you tell the story that is forming for you, as opposed to, why are you being such a jerk? Right? Identify the behavior and then tell how you are interpreting that behavior, because sometimes people don't realize that that's how they're coming off, or they're having a bad day and they don't realize that that's the energy that they're bringing forward for you.
What are some ways that we can gracefully end a conversation in which you feel that you have made no impact or progress?
I think, again, I would remind people that tool of what is it you're taking away from this conversation, because they might say something and say, okay, well, then maybe we could pick this up again because, and you want to reiterate what shared like feeling you have. Like, man, I'm taking away from this that we might have a lot that we disagree on, but we both agree in the value of the importance of parents being able to feel good about how they're treating their kids. And I think we can build from that going on from here, because how I interpret that is going to be different than how you interpret that. But what I hear you saying is this: what is it that you're hearing me say, right? Just to kind of model the ways in which you're processing and hoping that they mirror that back. And I'm not saying it's a magic wand moment, y'all. It's not like you just do this once and then boom. But over time, people's defenses begin to fall, and relationships are developed through disclosure. When we feel like we peel back those layers of social defenses with people, it becomes easier to connect with them.
And another question that we had coming in, are you familiar with SCARF, CARFE model? Because this
You know
sounds
what? I am not. I'm gonna have to look this up, because that didn't, when someone wrote that in the chat, that did not jump out at me. So I look forward to learning more about that. But from what I hear, it says it's based on the physiology of the brain status. I'm gonna have to look that up, because that sounds fascinating. Thank you, Nicoletta, for sharing that forward. And y'all admit what you don't know. Admit like, hey, I've never heard of that. I'm gonna go look that up, because we all aren't boundless encyclopedias, and it's always good to learn more.
And then I think we have time for just one more question, but any suggestions for what to do when those stimulus that don't require response, but you know are going to be harmful for others to hear? So like, what can you do when there's something that doesn't require stimulus, and what do you do if that's going to be harmful?
So I think when I say like not every stimulus requires a response, I think sometimes that happens within a conversation with people, that people will say things and you want to like jump in. You can always sort of call back when the temperature has died down a little, and to say, hey, a few minutes ago you said this, and it's really got me unsettled, because what I'm interpreting from that is this, And I think that really upset me, and it's probably upsetting other people in the room. So I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of understand a little bit about like why you brought that forward in that way. And they're probably like, I didn't mean it like that. I'm so sorry. Or they're going to be like, that's exactly what I mean by it. And then, okay, then this whole dialogue, it's not, again, communication has to have two willing participants, but sometimes, like I said before, we model what we see and what we hear. And so when someone else is showing that positive, productive communication pattern, we tend to reflect back what we see. So hopefully that was helpful for whoever asked that question. If you want to connect more with me, you can email me at adambrooksphd@gmail or adam.brooks@ua.edu, or connect with me anywhere that you might be able to find me. But I really appreciated all of your help and all of your insights and engagement today. I've really appreciated that. And hopefully you were able to gain some perspective that you can use in your life going forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brooks, for being here. We really appreciate it. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. We are at the top of the hour, and we will see you for our next webinar, hopefully. Thank you.